Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. The news from Iraq continues dreary. A suicide bombing in Baghdad today, many dead, many wounded. In addition, the regime is looking, the Maliki government is looking to push back very ineffectively. There was a helicopter assault near Tikrit reported within these last hours. It not only failed, the helicopter crashed. ISIS celebrating. We're some 40 hours from Ramadan. Ramadan is a period of celebration and religious devotion. At the same time, you don't eat all day, which means that our jihadists, our cutthroats, will be on sweets, super pumped up. There's recruiting all through Europe and around the world for the jihad. This is not a local matter anymore. They're directing their attacks at the lifeline for the Maliki government, which is the oil exports, 3.5 million barrels a day. Iraq, I remind you all, you can remember this from the Gulf War, the accusations of the several Bush administrations of blood for oil. Iraq sits on a 143 billion barrels reserved, proved reserved. It's second only to Saudi Arabia. And that is now at risk. So is the 3.5 million barrels a day. Who can replace it? Very good question. Saudi Arabia, perhaps. Oil prices trending higher. You can look at Iraq as not the future of oil export in the Persian Gulf. The people who are pressing on the Baghdad regime right now do not intend to export oil. Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, joins me because we're going to go from the dreary news overseas to happy news at home. This is domestic matter. As something that is called the Export-Import Bank. I know it sounds like we're talking about an Ian Fleming novel in which you go in the door and then they shoot you. But the Export-Import Bank is based upon a theory of government that is long since left behind in the 20th century. Command economy from on high. The federal government has to act in order for the economy to respond. Mary, a very good evening to you. You have spoken of the Export-Import Bank with me over the years, and I never paid any attention because it seemed extremely difficult to follow. And suddenly it's in the news. You knew this was going to happen. It's not only in the news, but the newly elected, who could believe how it happened, Kevin McCarthy, his first out loud policy statement, I believe, as majority leader of the Republican Party is, nah, to the Export-Import Bank. I believe Mr. Scalise, the new whip, said, nah, it's not going to happen. The Republicans do command the majority in the House of Representatives. So suddenly I'm going to look at the Export-Import Bank again, and then I see Damien Paletta in your newspaper reporting that 4 senior officials are under investigation for graft kickback. I learned from my colleague Larry Kudlow that it's long been known that the Export-Import Bank is cronyism times 50. Suddenly I'm back to Kissel. What the heck is it, Mary, and why are they shutting it down? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. Yes, this is very new because the Export-Import Bank for many years, like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, are taxpayer-backed mortgage insurers that blew up our housing market, were the beneficiaries of a bipartisan set of cronies who supported it through those 8 decades. And now all of a sudden you have a new breed of Republicans who are questioning, why do we have this bank? Is it good for taxpayers? Does it actually fulfill its mission? And if it doesn't, well, should we let it continue to live? Because the bank's charter expires periodically, and this latest expiration is at the end of September.
What does it do that we could actually argue we understand?
So, to put it simply,
right,
the Export-Import Bank is supposed to help the clients of U.S. companies that export goods. So effectively, it would go to, let's say, an airline in India and say, oh, you want to buy Boeing airports from Seattle? Well, we will put U.S. taxpayers behind that purchase. We will give you a loan guarantee to buy those airplanes. Of course, the problem with that, John, is, well, there are several problems with that, but the biggest problem with that is that the bank distorts decision-making. It picks winners and losers, and it uses those taxpayer guarantees to give unfair advantages to some firms over others. And when you talk about government like this, it inevitably ends up in cronyism and special deals. And that's why that story that you mentioned about Damien Paletta was so important this week, because the media has never really focused on the Export-Import Bank until recently. And I think the more they dig into it, the more of that stuff they're going to find.
Export-Import Bank, who does it compete? I mean, they're picking winners. Who Who in the private sector does this? Everybody, right? You go to a big bank and you borrow money.
Everybody does this. Every big bank does trade financing, and their mission is inherently conflicted because if you listen to the CEO, Fred Hochberg, who is a Clinton-era guy, very smooth, actually a very nice person in person, but if you listen to him talk about the bank, he says, well, we go to places that the private sector doesn't go. Well, if the private sector isn't going there, why would you ever want to put taxpayers behind it? It doesn't make any sense.
The claim, and all it is I learned from the news, is that it made money last year.
Right. So the Export-Import Bank lost money for long periods of time in the 1980s, but I guess the leadership today has forgotten that era because that was a little while ago. And if you apply a market, the same accounting that you would apply to private firms, they're losing money today. So I wouldn't listen to that. I think the real issue is the political issue of the Export-Import Bank's lending to small businesses. Because no politician, Democrat or Republican, is going to stand up and say, you know what, we really need to lend more with taxpayer backing to Boeing and General Electric. The real issue is that Democrats and a large portion of the Republican caucus are worried about what is going to happen when they go home to their districts and they say, golly gee, that little guy in Michigan who is exporting electronic chips to China, what am I going to say to him when we cut off this bank? And that is becoming the argument on Capitol Hill.
Let me see if I understand. The Export-Import Bank finds customers overseas.
Correct.
And goes to them and says, we'll lend you this money if you buy from American firms.
From U.S. companies. But what it does two things. It puts taxpayers behind that risk.
Right.
It discriminates against U.S. companies. So Delta is the most prominent example of this. The Export-Import Bank backed Air India for $1 billion. Air India flooded the New York-Mumbai route, and Delta couldn't compete. So the Delta CEO earlier this week said that cost us 1,000 jobs, and you unfairly helped my competitor because he was buying U.S. airplanes.
That's an example of government. It strikes me because I've just gone through Amity Schley's book, Forgotten Man Again. Strikes me as government that's out of fashion. But not only that, it's an antique because there was a less. Let me be generous. There was less thorough understanding of how government picking winners distorts the economy and retards growth when the Export-Import Bank was born in the 1930s. We have a better understanding of that.
Both the Republican and the Democratic Party are very happy to give Export-Import Bank handouts. John Campbell, a retiring Republican from California, just this week announced, let's do a deal, let's do a compromise and keep this thing open because first of all, he's retiring. What does he care? Right. But Peter King here in New York, a Republican from Illinois. There are a lot of people out there. There was a letter that was organized from the Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers this week, more than 800 organizations lobbying to keep this thing. Effectively, the Republicans that are going along to get along, keeping this thing alive, they don't know how to explain when they go back to their districts what's going to happen when these small businesses
So they don't know how to explain how private enterprise works.
No, they don't.
Nor do they understand.
That's the issue.
Nor do they understand how foreign trade, free trade benefits everyone around the globe, and that's a virtuous circle.
Right. But look, regardless of the size of the business, if it's a big business, if it's a small business, if you're putting taxpayer money behind it, you're subsidizing it.
Right.
You're giving it unfair advantages versus its American peers, and you're also distorting capital flows because if you're putting taxpayer money behind it and you can get cheap financing through Export-Import Bank, well, why wouldn't you benefit that? Why wouldn't you support that project? Other banks will pile right on.
Now I understand it. I translated into Ariane Space, looking to compete with private space launch vehicles in this country, and they're depending upon the subsidies from the European Union to maintain competition with an organization such as SpaceX that doesn't need subsidies.
John, I'm fine with that. If you want European taxpayers to pay for that, good for them.
Right, but it's not competition. It's back scratching. It's big government picking winners, and it's also a distortion of the marketplace, so that private space competes vigorously with Ariana Space. They have an advantage in that they subsidize all of their salaries.
John, this is the biggest test for the Republican Party before the November elections. This is the time to stand up against...
Wasn't it enough that McCarthy and Scalise said no?
No, this is the time to stand up against crony capitalism. Will they do it? We're about to find out.
Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, and the host, oh yes, Mary, the host of Opinion Journal, each day at WSJ.com. And when we come back, we're going to speak much of Mary's hosting of Opinion Journal today. She was speaking today of Iraq. We're also going to go around the world tonight with Patrick Travanik, who's going to join us on air. He's recently come back from an around the world trip. But next, Central Park in New York is the place where two bizarre stories, one tragic and the other one, I'd have to say, farcical, within these last days. I'm John Batchelor.